My name is Lorente. I'm the director of the Latin American Studies Center, and this event is being co-sponsored, co-organized with Latin American Studies Center and the United States Latino Studies Program, which is in the American Studies Program at the University of Maryland. You can get all of that. And we are really happy to have a series of a couple different talks this semester. One of them, as you know, because you're all here, is Cuba and Cuba-America. And the other one is going to be held on May 1st, and it will be about El Salvador and Central America. And we'll have a similar panel of what we're trying to do here is get different perspectives on a relationship. Obviously, that's constantly changing, and there's some new possibilities and potentials coming up in the near future. So we're here to discuss that, and the structure will be essentially this. I'll give you brief introductions. The full bios are here on the pages, so please take a look at those if you want the full details on our panel here. We will have, each person will have about 5 minutes, five-ish, to just tell you a little bit about where they're coming from and why they are passionate or interested about this topic from their perspective and in their experience. And then Dr. Mirabal will be moderating a series of questions that we will discuss. And at that point, we'll then open it up to all of you. And hopefully we will just have discussion going on. The theme for this, although we have Cuba and Cuba-America, is also Cubanos and Cuban American, right? If we're going to play with language and perspective in that way, is home. So what does that mean? And we're looking not just geographically, but how do people both in Cuba and here construct that idea and live it and experience it and work with it in their daily lives in various ways. And so our panelists will also loosely have ideas about that, but that's just a guiding concept for us to begin to rally around. And we'll see where the conversation goes, because it will go on. I will just give a brief introduction to all of our folks here. Mavis Anderson, right over there, covers U.S. policy toward Cuba, cultivating congressional, organizational, and grassroots support for the Latin America Working Group Coalition's efforts to end the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Netfa Freeman, our lost but found panelist, welcome, is the events coordinator at the Institute for Policy Studies and has been in the Cuba Solidarity Movement since 1993. He's a founder and lead organizer in both the D.C. Havana Sister City Project and the No War on Cuba movement. Rafael Lorente is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Director of the Master's Program at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism here at Maryland. As a reporter in Washington for the Sun Sentinel, Lorente covered U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America, particularly Cuba. Mirabal is Associate Professor of American Studies here at Maryland and is an affiliate faculty at the Latin American Studies Center. She is a historian who has published in the fields of Afro-diasporic communities in the United States and is completing a book entitled Hemispheric Notions, Diaspora, Masculinity, and the Racial Politics of Cubanidad in New York, 1823 to 1945. Ricardo Ortíz is Associate Professor of U.S. Latino Literature in the English Department at Georgetown University. His first book, Cultural Erotics in Cuba and America, was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2007. He teaches and studies hemispheric, transnational, American studies, critical and cultural theory, intellectual history, race, gender, queer theory, and political theory. So he covers a lot. My name is Lorente, as I mentioned before. I am a cultural anthropologist. I'm a professor here in performance studies, and I'm also in the Latin American Studies Center. I've been working in Cuba since 1995, and I've been doing ethnographic research on primarily the central and eastern mountainous areas of Cuba, and I work with artists and intellectuals. And my book is entitled Trumpets in the Mountain, Theater and the Politics of National Culture in Cuba. So that's where we're coming from. Who would like to begin? Mavis, would you like to? Sure.
Thank you all for coming. Came in and there were probably 26 set up, and I think we have 40. Somehow Cuba does that. It draws people in, especially if you've ever been there. How many of you have been to Cuba? All of you need to go. It's a wonderful place to visit. I work at the Latin America Working Group, which is a you some ideas of how to interact, how to carry out citizen diplomacy, how to be in touch with your members of Congress and the Obama administration and encourage them to keep on this path, to move toward reconciliation rather than aggression. So please help yourself to those after the presentations.
We're just going on. Okay. Hi, everyone. I want to thank Professor Frederick for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel. I've been under the weather all week. I don't think I'm contagious anymore, but I'm going to keep these remarks sort of brief so that I can save what I still have in my voice for the conversation. So a couple of things. This is not to proselytize, but I brought the book that I wrote in 2007 called Cultural Erotics in Cuban and America. So I'm a literature guy. I'm in an English department at Georgetown, and I specialize in U.S. Latino literature. And the book is primarily about the dynamics of gender and sexuality politics in Cuban American literature and culture. So I feel a little bit out of my depth on this panel, but I wanted to at least sort of mark where I come from disciplinarily. And if you're interested in this word, if you Google my last name Ortíz and the word erotics, after about 3 pages of porn sites, you can go to the Amazon page for my book. I'm also, so it's Cuban already, right? I'm also the guy who wrote a book on Cuban American sexuality and gender, and forgot to mention, except maybe I think in one footnote, the guy who eventually became the inaugural poet in 2013 for the second inauguration of President Obama, happens to be a gay Cuban American poet. Anyway, so, whatever. So the book's already kind of outdated, but it says almost nothing about Richard Blanco. So just to say a little bit more about myself and my sort of relationship to what we're talking about, I think I can keep this fairly personal. I was born in Cuba in 1961, so a year plus into the revolution, and my family mostly left in 1966 when I was 5 years old, and rather than settle in South Florida, we settled in Southern California, so I shared that with Professor Mirabal. And so I come from really kind of the outskirts of the outpost of the exile, right? I'm almost in some ways, to the extent that I have a sense of my sort of Cuban exile, Cuban immigrant, Cuban American identity. I come to it and from it from a really, really, I think, anomalous and in some ways kind of outside perspective. I will say that I agree with everything that Mavis has said about my own sort of political read of the political situation and the big change that happened in December of this past year. So anything about my politics would make this I'll say that. And I think I'll leave it at that. I am primarily an expert in U.S. Latino literature and culture, broadly speaking, in a comparative way. I think mostly outside the sort of the category of the nation state piece these days in the ways that I think about cultural and literary formations that interest me. But every now and then Cuba sort of pulls me back. The work that I did in the first book pulls me back, and I'm happy to be here to be part of this conversation today.
Hello, I'm Rafael Lorente. I am a Cuban American, also with a kind of an anomalous background as well. The first thing I'll say is these guys are experts and I'm a reporter. I'm an expert at nothing. And Lori has had no conversations with me to know that. So I kind of look at the world differently. I don't look at the world in that research way. My connection to this is twofold. My parents came to this country in 1961 as teenagers from different parts of Cuba and met here. So I was born in the U.S. Grew up in Miami, Massachusetts, ended up in Maryland, went back to Miami, and ended up in Maryland again. So I'm sort of, I have some of that same dissonant feeling that Ricardo described. At a very young age, was given an opportunity to go very far away from Miami and live with people very different than me, and kind of threw me off a little bit. I look at this entire thing a lot of times as a reporter because I don't talk about my politics, and I'm not likely to tell you what I think about the embargo before this is over, although I might. The home thing really did strike me when Lori first sent that message to me because I've never really had a good answer for where was home. Miami was home, I guess, at some point. Northern Massachusetts was home, except in sources of mine. I used to talk to Mavis when I was a reporter. And I walked into a little hotel in Havana, and I said something to one of the clerks or something, and a rather angry security guard came running out, tried to throw me out of the hotel. What'd I do? You're not allowed here. Cubans aren't allowed here. This was a tourist hotel at the time. Okay, I get it. So she came and begged him to leave me alone, and I walked off. And about a day or two later, I was doing an interview, and a young woman says, "Where are you from?" She says in Spanish. "I'm from Washington. I lived here at the time I was a reporter." He said, "No. Where are you really from?" And I didn't get it at first, and then I realized that she could hear that I was Cuban, but she knew I wasn't really Cuban, right? And that was sort of one of those moments in my life when I thought, oh, I don't really know where home is, because I clearly don't belong here, and I'm not sure I belong anywhere else. There's one question that I know is going to come up today, and I'll kind of throw a little marker on it really early, which is sort of this notion of what happens next. We have the December 17th announcement and negotiations, and I'm sure everyone at this table gets people coming up to them and go, oh, when am I going to be able to go to Cuba? When can I, buy a beach house? When can I? And my answer over the years has evolved, but my latest answer is something to this effect, which is whatever is next for once ought to be about those people down there. Regardless of what we think of the American policy, the Cuban government, or anything in between. Whatever is next shouldn't be about our tourism, it shouldn't be about our companies, it shouldn't be about which beaches we can get a suntan in. It ought to be about the people who are still down there who haven't done all that well for a long time for whatever reason. So I'll leave it there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm not Cuban, and most of my relationship with Cuban people, are Cubans in the country on the island. I don't know a lot of Cuban Americans, and those that I do know seem to, they don't necessarily identify with the revolution. And since I'm an activist and actually consider myself politically revolutionary, I can identify with the revolution in Cuba. And when I think about this question of home, it's interesting because my political background and orientation is to identify as a Pan-Africanist, and people will call me an American, but I don't even consider America home. And I think that because of the political, social, cultural disposition that, in fact, people of African descent have with the United States, it's a very complex one. So I can identify with the internationalism that Cubans on the island have. They actually have a saying, those that are identify with the revolution, that says that Cubans, they identify with Africa, and they say all Cubans have Africa running through their veins or something like that. I can't remember, that's the exact quote. and so that's something to me that I can't help but escape, that something about that idea, that ideology, affects how they perceive home too. They're a very internationalist country that's done a lot for a lot of other countries around the world, including Africa, all over Latin America. It's very selfless, in my opinion, that they don't really, I don't see anything that they get that's reciprocal when it comes to sending doctors or teachers and those kind of things. And in fact, it's an interesting relationship that Cuba has with the world juxtaposed to the United States has with the world, where the United States will send drones and soldiers and so and then everything that they do in terms of aid it has a lot of political strings attached to it when it comes to other countries. It's a very interesting comparison if you were to so long has been a multifaceted and protracted war against the country. It involves, in fact, the Cuban Five, and as Mavis talked about, we mentioned the three that were released, were, it was a specific thing. They weren't just here to spy on the Cubans, Cuban-America. They were here because there's been terrorism orchestrated against the country. We don't hear about all sorts of terrorist acts, blowing up hotels, all kind of things, putting biological planting diseases in livestock and all that stuff through with the either acquiescence or assistance of the United States government. And the Cuban agents who were sent here to see how they could thwart the terrorism that was happening. It was affecting tourism and all that kind of stuff. And so, and what's ironic about this now, when we see these negotiations going on, you hear John Kerry and others saying that, and now also how many people know that the United States has a terrorist countries that support terrorism, a list of countries that support terrorism, and they author this list, and of course they're not on it, but they also determine who else is on it. So Cuba's on a country that's on the list of countries that support terrorism, and this might seem like just an accusation. It's completely baseless, but it does more to enforce the blockade. It makes it hard for the country to get credit. Even the Cuban intersection here, the diplomatic mission, is not able to establish a bank account to do the business. And so these are the kind of things that are happening. And so it's ironic that the United States would have Cuba on this list of terrorists, and at the same time be actually one of the most terrorizing countries in the world. People might argue with me, but there's facts, there's history to prove U.S. disposition around the world. And so I think it's one of the things that we should be doing and advocating, those who want normalized relations. And it's going to be kind of bizarre and ironic to have normalized relations with Cuba, yet you're listing them as a state sponsor of terrorism. One of the things we should push for is that they simply remove Cuba off the terrorist list and allow for normal transaction, financial transactions, and things like that around the world. The blockade, when it comes to the embargo, it's extraterritorial in nature. So it's not just U.S. trade, prohibits trade with Cuba, but it actually is designed to prohibit, to make it hard for Cuba to have trade with other countries. And so it's a very insidious disposition. And I think that kind of strays from the home question. But in a way it doesn't, because for me, it's hard for me politically to identify with a country or a place and that has such a disposition and to call it home. So I would imagine that that home for Cubans has to also look at how do we identify the things nationally and politically and culturally. So anyway, I'll stop there.
So I'm Nancy Mirabal, and good afternoon. Thank you for being here on a Friday. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Lori for putting this panel together. Lori did an excellent job, so thank you very much for putting this together. I am a historian, and home for me, unlike some other folks, home has always been very important. This concept of where we belong, who's our community. And the reason for that is that I am Cuban, both of my parents are from Cuba, but we have such a different trajectory. My parents moved, they were economic migrants who left Cuba in the early 1950s. They were teenagers, and my parents actually met in New York, because this is where Cubans went in the early 50s. They didn't go to Miami. Miami is a post-1959 reality. And so most Cubans who left the island, who were economic migrants, to work in the factories, ended up in New York. And so my parents actually met in New York. And my father worked in a factory, and my mom was a hairdresser. So they met in New York. My brother was born in New York. New York got too cold. I understand what they mean, being here in D.C. And they moved to Los Angeles. And the reason that they moved to Los Angeles was very simple. They said, where's the barrio? Where do they speak Spanish? Right? And the barrio is East LA. So I was literally, like Chicha Marin, born and raised in East LA. And so the thing is that in East LA, century, I look at the early 20th century, I look at Afro-Cubans. Most of my work has been on the relationship between Cuba and the African diaspora, which is very extensive in the US. And a lot of my work has been on the early communist organizers of the 1920s and the 1930s, and who then organized several other clubs. And then the question of politics and of Afro-Cubanidad and what that meant before '59. So for me, it has always been very interesting to say that our history cannot be defined. In fact, I wrote an article on this, that our history here cannot be defined by 1959. And it is a longer trajectory in that people in the United States, Cubans, and in Cuba have a longer history of migration, of racialization, of political organization. If you even look at music, a lot of people like music and popular culture, you have to look into the 40s and 50s when you have people like Machito, Chano Bozo, Mario Bauza, who are coming in and they're meeting up with Dizzy Gillespie and they're creating all of these sounds. As well as writers and thinkers, right? We know about Nicholas Guillen, who comes in and hangs out with Langston Hughes, and they're writing about the future. And what they had in common was, how does this future for us look like as Afro-diasporic peoples? What does blackness necessarily mean? And for me, that has been my life's work. That's this last book. I'll never write a book that's over 100 years. It was mammoth. But it looks at 1823 to about, now it's 1945, now it's 1956. And it really looks at all of these connections. So for me, looking at home is being able to decide for ourselves what home looks like. And to decide that the questions that we ask are those that come from our experiences. And so I do have family in Miami, and I have family in New York, and I have family in Cuba. And it's very interesting that it's true that location has a lot to do with how you think about where you're from. People in Miami, my family in Miami, have a certain way of thinking about Cuba because they're right there. And they're listening to the, the news and reading the newspapers, and they're very close to politics. People in New York have a different reading of it, and of course people in California, when I go to Cuba to visit my family, they always tell me, you sound like a Mexicana when you speak Spanish, that I don't even sound Cuban. And then they laugh because the Cuban that I do know, the language, is pre-59, so I didn't realize, unbeknownst to me, that I was going to Cuba saying words like groovy and far out, right? Because that's the language of my parents. So I was learning Spanish through my parents, right? So they were like, okay, chévere, these really horrible things that you shouldn't say in Cuba because it really shows just how out of style you are. And so it's even that in questions of language, how we fabricate and think about home. But we always had connections. My father would go to Cuba in the 70s. I went to Cuba several times over to see family. And I think Mavis is absolutely right in that we have family members who passed away who couldn't be there for them. And I also wanted to say that besides positioning 59 as a normative, which I think is more of an outlier in my experiences in my written, I also think that Cubans themselves, Cuban Americans themselves, have been a force in changing this policy and way of thinking. So Florida, for instance, voted for President Obama and went Democratic. If you look at any, let's say, statistics or surveys, it was shown that second-generation Cubans are no longer interested in the politics, to use the metaphor, of their parents. There's never my parents' politics, but of the older generation's politics. They see the futility in it. They see that there's no future in it. So the question for me is, how do we reconfigure Cubanidad in the 21st century? What do we take? What do we leave behind? How do we move forward? And so those are the questions that I would like to think about as well.
My name is Frederick, and I am an anthropologist, and so my work is ethnographic. And what anthropologists, our mode of conducting research is trying to figure out how people tell stories about themselves to themselves. How people tell stories to themselves about themselves. There's actually a cleaner phrase, but you understand what I'm saying. So for me, doing my research in Cuba, it was about trying to understand how Cubans were defining themselves and telling each other. So my work is very much within Cuba, between Cubans. I work obviously in Havana and the different urban centers, but my primary focus was in the mountain areas, so Escambray, in between Santa Clara and Cienfuegos, and in Guantanamo so those were the areas, and I spent 1 year in each location working with artists and intellectuals and campesinos. So a lot of what I was looking at in terms of national identity and home, and this was post-1990, so my interest had to do with what happens during a time of change when people are trying to figure out who they are if Marx is no longer the structural ideal, right? How are they telling each other what cubanidad is? So in terms of these stories and in terms of these constructions of stories, how are they changing, right? And what's happening in these mountainous regions, one of the jokes for the campesinos there and the people who are living in these small towns is that even the revolution has not arrived, right? Forget this, all these different changes with tourism and so forth. These are places where tourists are not going. So what is home is not a here and there, the there being Miami or New York, the United States. Sometimes the there or the allá is Havana. And in Guantanamo, Havana is más allá. And the United States would be, there would just be a hand gesture for it, right? So a perspective of where your home is had to do with where the local was. And so that's really what I was focusing on in my research, is how are these people talking to each other about what Cubania is after 1990, and always in relationship to historical legacy and what their future is as well, right? What these ideas of Oriente versus Occidente are. What does it mean to be in a place called a zone of silence? These are the places that I was working for, small towns in Guantanamo City and Cienfuegos, but also up into the mountains where there was no electricity, no roads in many instances, right? And so it was a very different form of communication, a very different form of how culture is communicating to each other. I worked with theater companies that were traveling into the mountains to share theater and dance and music with the campesinos. So obviously these are state artists, right? These are people who are being funded by the government. And I work with artists as part of my world here. And so how do, this idea, we have this very distinct thing about what is good and what is bad and free expression, right? And that home is freedom. I mean, there's a certain sense of that home is either freedom or home is something that is censored that we have to fight against. And I think there's different perspectives we've been talking about here, right? Where are we fleeing from? Where are we longing? What are we longing for? What are we trying to return to? All these different tugs of war about what's going on. And so I'm looking at, I look at how the artists as professional people who represent culture and tell stories and theatricalize an idea of what people are living in every day, and what the people themselves were saying. So in this dialogue between the artists and also the local people on a very, very local level, but also how they were then communicating this back up to the state, this kind of amorphous thing that is seen to be, in Havana for the most part, or farther away. So that was where I was constructing my research. In terms of what's happening, Cuba and America, it was very much about a different kind of nostalgia. The nostalgia wasn't for here or there in that sense. The nostalgia was, who are we as Cubans and what are we about to lose? So the anxiety and the stress about an identity and about what home is what do we have to work towards to maintain this idea of home and what's important and who has the power to decide? I was just there in February for 2 weeks, and this was very much on people's minds given Obama and Raul Castro's speech, right? What is going to happen now? There's this constant sort of, it's not just the 1959, it's not just a revolutionary perspective, but how are these different transitions happening throughout, and what are the stories that maintain, right? That keep them grounded in some idea of home, whether it's regardless of what location they're in. I write about preemptive nostalgia, right? How people, and this happens in any country in the world, but how people, especially artists and people who are in the cultural industry, how they make sure that these stories are put on a stage or put into a book, into a story. A lot of what Ricardo is looking at are very similar. How are these stories put into a literature and then seen as valuable and authentic and something that they have to save? So I will end it there. Nancy, so what we're going to do is just have some questions that we've established before. So feel free, I guess, we can kind of see how it goes. If there's a moment when one of the panelists does not have anything burning to say and somebody in the audience has something burning to say, please raise your hand, and if there are openings, we will do it that way, but also we will mostly just open it up at the end.
You want to ask a question? Okay.
George.
So one of the questions that I think might be good to start is, for years, the end of the diplomatic relations and embargo have defined how Cubans in the United States and those on the island see themselves. Do you think that these recent changes between both countries will change that definition of how Cubans see themselves? Because the revolution has so highly defined both Cubans and Americans. And if so, how? Anybody?
I'm not sure if this is them seeing themselves differently, but I think it may be the potential to see themselves differently. I had a number of friends who were in Cuba at a meeting on December 17th, and with Cuban colleagues were in a conference, and up on the wall was a TV set where they watched the two presidents speak, and with mouths hanging open, because those of us who work on policy we knew something was happening in the White House, and that there was going to be some kind of an announcement. We didn't know when. It was sooner than we expected, and we didn't know how much, and it was bigger than we expected. And that's how Cubans on the island acted too, say my friends who were there. They were literally dancing in the streets, spontaneous musical groups out, celebrating in the streets, where people were saying, this is a whole new possibility for us in terms of how we can relate both to the United States but also to the world, because as Netfa said it, the embargo is an extraterritorial law that impacts how Cuba has been able to relate to the rest of the world, though I must say that Cuba has done a lot better job of that than the United States has, and while our policy has been to isolate Cuba and to cut them off from the world and from family, what really happened is the United States was the one who was isolated in this policy. Every year there's a vote in the United Nations that Cuba brings forward to the General Assembly about the embargo, and every year the United States loses that vote big time. The last vote was 188 against the embargo and 2 in favor of the embargo. The United States, and can you guess what other country? Israel. Israel. So the isolation and the separation that our policy has intended for Cuba has reverted back to ourselves on this issue. And I think Cubans are very proud of the way that they have been able to circumvent the embargo with the rest of the world, and they do have relations with the rest of the world. So I think that it may not only change how Cubans see themselves, but it hopefully will also change how the United States citizens see ourselves in relation to Cuba.
Anybody want to add to that or a comment?
So, I'm not sure this is a fully formed thought, so I apologize if I make no sense, but the relations between the United States and Cuba, the United States has coveted Cuba in some way going back to Thomas Jefferson. It's not as if it's all, as you said, it's not. And so, if whatever comes next leaves people on the island going, oh boy, there they come again, and leaves people on this side going, hey, we want that and they don't want us there, then we're using different terms, and maybe it's not Fidel, and maybe it's not Khrushchev, but we're still kind of stuck in this conversation that isn't going to lead us anywhere, and isn't going to help certainly the people who probably could use the most help. Again, I apologize. Not quite fully formed.
We can go to another question.
My comment. This might sound cynical.
Well, Cuba.
No. Well, about the relations, I think
all of that is vital, right, and important. And if we take sort of the utter brutal fact of limited sovereignty in mind, right, and you look at the neighborhood, and you look at the other sovereign nations in the Caribbean, and you start thinking, okay, I guess what I'm balking at here a little bit is taking too exceptionalist a view of this, even though I do think it's quite exceptional about the history that we're talking about and that we're about to come out of, right? But the thing that we're going to probably enter is going to be a world that looks a lot more like what the surrounding world has looked like. So I think it's a version of what you were saying, right? And what does it mean to say that? What does it mean to sort of envision that as the next thing that's going to happen in terms of better and worse, right? In terms of just at least to the extent that whatever this significant transformative ethical change that just happened opens a door to, right? I think anybody who looks at this and sort of sees it with realistic eyes and with cynical eyes has to say, okay,